Do you take Victoria Hale to be your lawfully wedded wife? The question floated through the cathedral ballroom like smoke. Elegant, polished, expected. But Ethan Cole never answered. His lips parted slightly. His eyes locked somewhere beyond the diamond chandeliers, beyond the ocean of tailored tuxedos and champagne gowns, beyond the cameras live streaming the most anticipated billionaire wedding in Manhattan that year. The silence stretched. Long enough for the violinists to glance at one another. Long enough for whispers to begin crawling across the room like cracks through glass. Victoria's smile froze first. Not vanished. Froze. The kind of stillness rich people master before panic reaches their eyes. Ethan wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at a black waitress near the back of the ballroom, a young woman balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes with hands so steady they almost looked detached from the chaos unfolding around her. Almost. Because if you looked closely, very closely, one finger trembled. Just once. Wait, Ethan said quietly. The microphone clipped beneath his collar caught every syllable. Thousands watching online heard it. Hundreds inside the ballroom stopped breathing. I know her. A ripple moved through the guests. Confused glances. Raised brows. The governor's wife lowered her wine glass. A venture capitalist near the front leaned toward his date and whispered something under his breath. Cameras shifted instantly away from the bride and toward the waitress no one had noticed 30 seconds earlier. Naomi Brooks felt every eye in the room hit her at once. It felt familiar. Not attention. Judgment. There's a difference. She lowered her gaze carefully, professionally, like someone used to shrinking herself inside rooms built for people with money. Her black uniform was simple. Crisp white cuffs. Hair pulled back neatly. Comfortable shoes hidden beneath the tablecloth shadows. She had already worked 11 hours that day. 2 servers had called in sick. Her mother's hospital bill was due Friday morning. And now somehow the richest man in the room was staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Victoria let out a tight laugh, soft. Enough to sound graceful, sharp enough to cut skin. Ethan, she whispered through her smile, what are you doing? But Ethan barely heard her. Because the moment Naomi shifted the tray against her palm, the ballroom disappeared. In its place came rain. Violent rain. Flashing headlights. Twisted metal beneath a collapsed guardrail somewhere outside Boston 7 years earlier. He remembered the smell first. Smoke and gasoline. Then blood rushing into his eyes. Then a voice. Calm. Female. Stay awake. Please stay awake. Ethan blinked hard. The memory hit like lightning behind his ribs. His heartbeat staggered. Naomi instinctively stepped backward, already sensing trouble. Wealthy rooms had rules. Waitresses were not supposed to become part of the story. Especially black waitresses. Especially not during a billionaire wedding broadcast across half the country. One of Victoria's friends folded her arms and muttered just loudly enough. These hotel girls always find a way to make things about themselves. A few uncomfortable chuckles followed. Naomi swallowed quietly and kept her posture straight. She did not defend herself. She did not react. Because dignity had taught her silence long before luxury ever taught these people manners. But Ethan's expression changed completely. The color drained from his face. His breathing slowed. And then his eyes dropped to Naomi's wrist. A thin silver bracelet peeked from beneath her sleeve. Worn. Old. Barely noticeable. Except Ethan remembered it perfectly. He remembered that bracelet gripping his hand through shattered rain and darkness while the world spun around him. He remembered the scar near her thumb. He remembered the woman who pulled him from a burning car while everyone else drove past. The woman who vanished before he woke up. Ethan took one slow step away from the altar. Then another. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Victoria's smile finally broke. Ethan, she snapped softly, panic leaking through the edges now. Get back here. But Ethan kept walking toward Naomi Brooks like the last 7 years of his life had suddenly rearranged themselves in front of him. The ballroom no longer sounded expensive. It sounded nervous. The soft violin music had faded into uneven silence, broken only by the clicking of camera shutters and the faint hum of whispered speculation moving table to table like electricity. Ethan Cole kept walking. Slow. Focused. Almost disoriented. The polished marble floor reflected the gold chandelier light beneath his shoes as if the entire room itself had tilted around him. Naomi stood frozen near the champagne station, her pulse hammering so loudly she could barely hear the guests anymore. Wealthy people were staring at her the way people stare at smoke before they smell the fire. Confused, suspicious, curious. She knew those looks. She had lived inside them for years. Victoria stepped down from the altar so quickly the train of her designer gown dragged sharply across the floor behind her. "Ethan," she said again, louder this time, forcing a smile for the cameras still recording. "You are making a scene." But Ethan barely reacted. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi's bracelet. Thin silver, tarnished at the clasp. A tiny engraving scratched near the edge. He remembered touching that bracelet through rain-soaked fingers while drifting in and out of consciousness inside a wrecked car upside down against a guardrail north of Boston. 7 years ago, he had been 32, arrogant, unstoppable, the youngest hedge fund executive on Wall Street to close a 10-figure acquisition before turning 35. That night, he had left a private investor retreat during a storm after an argument with one of his former partners. Heavy rain swallowed the highway. A truck hydroplaned 2 lanes over. Then headlights. Screeching tires. Glass exploding like ice. After that, darkness. Except for one voice. A woman's voice. Calm even while terrified. "Look at me. Stay awake." Ethan stopped less than 6 feet from Naomi now. The entire ballroom watched without blinking. Naomi lowered the tray carefully onto a nearby table because her hands had finally started shaking too hard to hide it. "Sir," she said quietly, professional instinct taking over before emotion could. "I think you are mistaken." Her voice hit him harder than the memory itself. Ethan stared at her as though time had folded inward. Same voice. Softer now. Older. But unmistakable. Victoria reached him at last and grabbed lightly onto his arm, her polished composure beginning to crack around the edges. "This is insane," she whispered sharply. "You are stopping our wedding over a waitress?" That word landed hard in the room. Waitress. Not woman. Not person. Just position. Naomi felt the heat rush into her face instantly. She stepped backward. "I should go," she murmured. But Ethan shook his head immediately. "No." The single word came out rougher than expected. Guests shifted in their seats. One investor near the front quietly lowered his phone from recording mode. Another guest leaned toward his wife and whispered, "What is happening right now?" Naomi tried to avoid Ethan's eyes, but he noticed something else then. A faint scar crossing the side of her wrist beneath the bracelet. Small, pale, almost invisible under the ballroom lights. Memory crashed into him completely. Rain pouring sideways across shattered glass. Smoke curling from the engine. A young black woman smashing the passenger window with a tire iron while other cars sped past without stopping. Her sleeve torn. Her hand bleeding. Her voice shaking but determined. "You do not get to die tonight." Ethan's chest tightened so suddenly he almost forgot where he was. Naomi saw it happen in his face. Recognition. Real recognition. Not the shallow kind rich people pretended to have when they forgot your name 5 minutes later. This was different. Dangerous. Emotional. Human. Victoria looked between them and finally understood the worst part. This was not attraction. This was history. And history was much harder to compete with. "Ethan," she said carefully now, aware of the cameras zoomed in around them. "Whatever this is, we can discuss it privately." But Ethan slowly turned toward her for the first time in nearly 2 minutes. And the expression on his face made the entire ballroom colder. Because for the first time all night, the billionaire groom no longer looked confident. He looked ashamed. The shame on Ethan Cole's face spread through the ballroom faster than gossip ever could. People who had spent years admiring him suddenly stopped seeing the billionaire on magazine covers and started seeing something else entirely. A man confronting a memory he should have honored long ago. Victoria noticed it too, and panic sharpened every movement she made. "Everyone is watching," she whispered tightly, forcing another practiced smile toward the cameras circling nearby. "Please do not do this here." But the problem was already bigger than embarrassment. The problem was truth. And truth has a way of ruining beautiful performances. Naomi kept her eyes lowered, wishing the marble floor beneath her feet would simply open and let her disappear into it. She had spent years mastering invisibility in places like this. Wealthy guests remembered wine labels before they remembered her face. Men in $10,000 suits snapped their fingers instead of saying, "Excuse me." Women covered in diamonds looked through her like she was part of the furniture. None of that surprised her anymore. What surprised her was Ethan looking at her like she mattered. That part felt dangerous. "Miss Brooks," the wedding coordinator hissed quietly as she rushed over, her headset trembling against perfectly styled blonde hair. "Please return to the service hallway immediately." Naomi nodded instantly. Of course. Remove the problem before the headlines spread. Standard procedure. She reached for the tray again, trying to move past Ethan carefully, but he stepped slightly into her path. Not aggressive. Desperate. "You saved my life," he said softly. The room inhaled all at once. A senator's wife near the second row slowly lowered her hand from her mouth. Someone near the back muttered, "What?" Naomi's throat tightened. "Sir," she answered carefully, "I do not think this is the right place." Ethan almost laughed at the irony of that. 7 years ago, she had dragged him out of twisted metal in the middle of a freezing storm while strangers drove past pretending not to see him. Now she was still protecting him, still trying to preserve his dignity while standing in a room full of people who had never once protected hers. Victoria finally dropped the polished bridal smile completely. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Ethan, she works here." The words sliced through the ballroom harder than intended. Naomi felt them land. So did everyone else. Ethan turned slowly toward Victoria, disbelief flickering across his face. "Do you hear yourself right now?" Victoria crossed her arms tightly. "I hear a woman interrupting my wedding." Naomi immediately shook her head. "No, ma'am, I was trying to leave." Her voice remained calm, but exhaustion hid beneath every syllable. Not physical exhaustion, the deeper kind. The kind that comes from spending your entire life being treated like your presence needs permission. Ethan saw it clearly now. The quiet restraint, the careful posture, the instinct to apologize even while being humiliated. And suddenly, another memory surfaced from that storm years ago. After pulling him from the wreck, Naomi had wrapped her thin jacket around his shoulders, even though she was shaking from cold rain herself. He remembered trying to speak, trying to ask her name, but she had simply smiled weakly and said, "Just stay awake for me, okay?" Then flashing ambulance lights. Then darkness. Ethan stared at her now as the weight of 7 lost years settled heavily into his chest. "I looked for you," he admitted quietly. Naomi blinked in surprise for the first time all night. "What?" "For years," Ethan said. "The police never found your name. The hospital records did not match anyone. I hired investigators." Murmurs exploded around the ballroom. Naomi looked genuinely stunned now. Not flattered. Saddened. "You should not have done that," she whispered. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why not?" Naomi finally lifted her eyes fully to his. And what he saw there was not anger. That would have been easier. It was disappointment. Calm. Deep. Human disappointment. "Because people like me are only remembered in rooms like this when something goes wrong." The silence after that sentence felt heavier than the cathedral ceiling itself. And for the first time that night, several guests looked away in shame. The silence inside the ballroom changed after Naomi said those words. It no longer felt awkward. It felt exposed, like someone had pulled the velvet curtain away from a room built entirely on appearances. Several guests suddenly became fascinated with their champagne glasses. Others stared at Naomi differently now, not because her uniform had changed, not because her paycheck had changed, but because Ethan Cole had forced them to see her as human. And for some people, that was the most uncomfortable thing in the world. Naomi could feel the shift immediately. She hated it. Not because attention scared her, but because pity always arrived wearing the same face as respect. Soft eyes, quiet voices, sudden politeness. She had seen it before. Usually right after people discovered she had suffered enough to become inspirational. Ethan noticed her discomfort instantly. "Naomi," he said carefully, as though even speaking her name carried weight now. "Why did you leave that night?" Naomi gave a small tired smile that barely reached her eyes. "Because the ambulance came." Ethan frowned slightly. "That is it. What else was I supposed to do?" she asked gently. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. To Naomi, saving someone's life had never been a transaction. It had not been a doorway into wealth or opportunity or recognition. It was simply the right thing to do. That truth settled heavily across the ballroom, especially among people accustomed to calculating value before kindness. Victoria let out a sharp breath through her nose. "This entire conversation is unbelievable." Her voice trembled now, not with sadness, but with humiliation. You are standing in the middle of our wedding talking about another woman. Ethan turned toward her slowly. I am talking about the woman who saved my life. Years ago, Victoria fired back instantly. And now she works banquets at a hotel. Ethan, people help strangers every day. Naomi flinched slightly at the word works. Not because she was ashamed of her job, because of the way wealthy people said it. Like employment determined dignity. Ethan heard it too. His jaw tightened. Do not do that, he said quietly. Do what? Victoria snapped. Reduce her to a uniform, he answered. The ballroom froze again. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Around them, camera operators exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to stop filming or move closer. One thing had become painfully obvious. This was no longer a wedding. This was a reckoning. Naomi looked toward the ballroom exit, silently calculating whether she could make it there without causing more damage. Her manager stood near the service doors looking horrified, already imagining lawsuits, headlines, angry investors, ruined contracts. Naomi felt guilty for all of it. That was who she was. Even in humiliation, she worried about everyone else first. Ethan noticed that too. You are still trying to protect people, he said softly. Naomi gave him a confused look. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, though the microphone still caught every word. 7 years ago, you stayed with me in freezing rain until the paramedics arrived. Another flash cut through his memory. Naomi kneeling beside him on wet pavement, her hands trembling from cold while she pressed his coat beneath his head to keep him awake. Her face soaked with rainwater, her voice steady despite fear. You kept talking to me, Ethan continued quietly. You told me about your mother. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. She had not expected him to remember that. You said she worked double shifts for 20 years and still smiled every morning because bitterness was expensive. Ethan swallowed hard. I never forgot that sentence. The ballroom remained completely silent now. Not forced silence. Listening silence. Naomi looked away for a moment, emotion finally threatening the composure she had carried all night. My mother still says that, she whispered. Ethan stared at her with something dangerously close to grief, because suddenly he understood the ugliest part of all this. The woman who had once saved his future had spent the last 7 years struggling quietly while he built empires, bought penthouses, appeared on magazine covers, and stood under crystal chandeliers believing success meant becoming untouchable. Meanwhile, Naomi Brooks had remained exactly who she was the night she pulled a stranger from the rain. Kind, invisible, and exhausted. The air inside the ballroom felt heavier now, as if every crystal chandelier hanging above the guests had suddenly become too large for the ceiling to carry. Nobody touched the wedding cake anymore. Nobody reached for champagne. Even the musicians sat frozen beside their instruments, waiting to see whether this night would end as a scandal or something far more dangerous. Something honest. Naomi glanced toward the giant windows lining the ballroom walls. Manhattan shimmered outside beneath the dark evening sky, thousands of lights blinking across the city like distant signals. Somewhere out there, people were laughing in restaurants, hurrying through subway stations, living ordinary lives completely unaware that one of the richest men in America had just stopped his own wedding because he finally recognized the black waitress everyone else ignored. The thought made her uncomfortable. Ethan, she said softly, trying one last time to restore order to the room. You do not owe me anything. He looked at her almost in disbelief. Do not say that. It is true. Naomi folded her trembling hands carefully in front of her apron so nobody would notice they were shaking. I helped someone who needed help. That is all. Ethan let out a quiet breath that sounded painfully close to regret. Because to Naomi, kindness had remained simple. But to Ethan, kindness had become rare. Measured. Negotiated. Monetized. He looked around the ballroom slowly then, finally seeing the room for what it really was. The billion-dollar floral arrangements. The imported Italian marble. The designer suits. The politicians smiling only when cameras turned their direction. For years, Ethan had believed power looked like this. Expensive. Untouchable. Controlled. But 7 years ago, lying trapped inside a ruined car while rain poured through shattered glass, power had looked completely different. It looked like a terrified young woman refusing to leave a dying stranger behind. Victoria stepped forward again, her patience finally collapsing beneath public humiliation. Enough, she snapped. This has gone far enough. The sharpness in her voice echoed through the ballroom. You are acting like she is some kind of saint. Naomi immediately shook her head. No, ma'am, please do not argue because of me. But Victoria barely looked at her. You think this is romantic? She demanded, staring directly at Ethan now. You think humiliating me in front of investors, senators, and half the media in New York makes you noble? Ethan answered quietly. No, I think pretending this moment does not matter would make me a coward. The sentence landed hard. Victoria stared at him as though she no longer recognized the man standing in front of her. Maybe she did not. Maybe Ethan barely recognized himself either. Because something inside him had cracked open the second he saw Naomi's bracelet beneath the ballroom lights. Not attraction. Not impulse. Conscience. The kind money cannot buy back once it wakes up. Naomi noticed several guests quietly wiping tears from their eyes now, though most pretended to fix makeup or adjust glasses instead. Funny how people become emotional only after they realize kindness came from someone they underestimated. Ethan stepped closer to Naomi again, lowering his voice slightly. What happened after that night? Naomi hesitated. Life happened. Naomi. The way he said her name this time carried genuine concern, not curiosity. After a long pause, she answered honestly. My mother got sick 2 years later. I left nursing school. Several people nearby reacted visibly to that sentence. Ethan looked stunned. You were in nursing school? Naomi nodded once. Community college in Worcester. I worked nights at a diner to pay tuition. Ethan remembered another detail suddenly. Rainwater dripping from her curls while she pressed trembling fingers against his wrist, searching for a pulse. You said you wanted to become an emergency room nurse, he whispered. Naomi gave a tiny surprised laugh under her breath. You really remember. You saved my life, Ethan replied quietly. Of course I remember. Naomi's expression softened for the first time all night, but sadness lingered beneath it. Dreams change when hospital bills arrive. That sentence moved through the ballroom like a cold wind, because everyone there understood exactly what she meant. Not one person in that room had ever needed to abandon a future because a parent got sick. Not one. Ethan looked around slowly at the luxury surrounding them again, and for the first time in years, the entire room made him feel ashamed instead of successful. The shame inside Ethan Cole no longer came in flashes. It settled into him fully now, heavy and impossible to ignore. He looked around the ballroom again and realized something almost unbearable. Hundreds of people had applauded him for becoming successful. Not one person had ever asked whether he had become good. The distinction hit hard. Naomi stood only a few feet away, still trying to disappear politely from a moment that refused to release her. Even now she carried herself carefully, like someone terrified of taking up too much space in rooms owned by other people. Ethan hated that. Not because it looked weak, but because he suddenly understood who taught her to stand that way. Society did. Years of being overlooked did. Wealthy guests who thanked white executives for ideas while handing black women empty glasses did. You left nursing school because of hospital bills, Ethan repeated quietly, still struggling to process it. Naomi nodded once. My mother needed surgery, then physical therapy, then medications insurance did not fully cover. She said it plainly. No bitterness. No dramatic performance. Just truth. And somehow that made it worse. Victoria crossed her arms tightly against the growing discomfort spreading through the room. There are charities for that, she said before she could stop herself. Several heads turned instantly. Naomi remained calm. Charities help, she answered gently. But they do not erase reality. Ethan looked at Victoria slowly. Do you hear how you sound tonight? Victoria laughed once, sharp and humorless. How I sound. Her voice rose slightly now, no longer caring who heard. I am not the one destroying a wedding over guilt. The word guilt lingered heavily between them. Because somewhere beneath her anger, Victoria had recognized the truth before anyone else. This was not romance. Ethan was not chasing excitement. He was confronting the ugliest realization of his adult life. The woman who once saved him had spent years sacrificing her own future while he lived inside unimaginable luxury completely unaware. Naomi immediately stepped back again. Please stop arguing because of me. Ethan turned toward her instantly. This is not because of you. Naomi gave him a tired look that carried far more wisdom than her age should have allowed. It always becomes about people like me eventually, she said quietly. Not who we are. What we represent. The ballroom fell silent again, because everybody understood exactly what she meant, even if they wished they did not. To some guests, Naomi represented charity. To others, she represented struggle. To a few uncomfortable people in that room, she represented guilt they had spent years avoiding. But to Ethan, she represented something entirely different now. Humanity untouched by power. And suddenly, all the polished wealth around him felt strangely hollow. One of the older investors near the front cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps this conversation should continue privately, he suggested carefully. Ethan looked toward him and shook his head. No, the answer came firm this time. Stronger. No more private rooms. No more pretending. A murmur spread through the crowd. Ethan stepped farther away from the altar then, physically distancing himself from the wedding stage built beneath imported white roses and golden candles. Every camera in the ballroom followed him. 7 years ago, he said slowly, voice carrying through the stunned silence. I nearly died alone during a storm while strangers drove past my car. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately, already uncomfortable with attention shifting toward her again. But Ethan continued. One person stopped. His gaze found Naomi instantly. One person climbed into freezing rain and stayed beside a complete stranger because she believed his life mattered. Several guests quietly wiped tears from their faces now. Others looked ashamed to be emotional only after discovering the hero wore a hotel uniform instead of a designer suit. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking again. And tonight I realized something terrifying. His voice cracked slightly for the first time all evening. If Naomi Brooks had walked into this ballroom before I recognized her, most people here would have looked straight through her. Nobody argued, because nobody could. The silence itself became confession. Naomi felt tears sting her eyes now, but she blinked them back quickly. Years of struggle had taught her that crying in front of wealthy people often made them uncomfortable enough to stop listening. Ethan saw her trying to stay composed, and suddenly understood another painful truth. Naomi had spent her entire life learning how to survive humiliation gracefully so other people could remain comfortable. The ballroom had become painfully quiet by then, the kind of silence that forces people to hear thoughts they normally drown beneath music and luxury. Ethan Cole stood beneath millions of dollars in crystal light, yet somehow the smallest voice in the room still belonged to Naomi Brooks. That fact alone unsettled everyone. She had not raised her voice once all night. She had not demanded attention. She had not tried to embarrass anyone. And still the entire evening now revolved around her existence. Not because she chased power, because she carried humanity into a room built almost entirely without it. Naomi wiped discreetly beneath one eye before any tears could fall completely. She hated crying in public, especially in front of people who might mistake emotion for weakness instead of exhaustion. You should finish your wedding, she said softly to Ethan. Several guests nodded instinctively, relieved to hear someone trying to restore order. Naomi forced a small smile. Your guest came to celebrate you. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Even now she was protecting his reputation. Even after being humiliated. Even after standing in a ballroom full of strangers who had reduced her to a uniform within seconds. Victoria noticed the softness in Ethan's expression immediately, and her face hardened. No, she said sharply. Do not turn her into some tragic saint because she happened to stop at an accident scene years ago. A few guests visibly winced at the cruelty hidden inside the sentence. Naomi lowered her eyes again, but Ethan finally looked at Victoria with complete clarity. Not anger. Clarity. Sometimes. Disappointment is colder than rage. You still do not understand, he said quietly. Victoria crossed her arms. Then explain it to me. Ethan looked around the ballroom slowly before answering. Everybody in this room spent years respecting me because I built companies. His eyes shifted toward Naomi. But the person with the strongest character here is the woman carrying a serving tray. The sentence landed like thunder. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. A famous tech executive near the back quietly removed the expensive watch from his wrist and slipped it into his pocket as though wealth itself suddenly felt embarrassing. Naomi shook her head immediately. Please do not say things like that. Ethan turned toward her. Why? Because tomorrow people will forget, she answered honestly. They always do. That sentence hurt because it sounded practiced, like experience speaking instead of insecurity. Ethan realized she had probably spent years watching emotional moments disappear the second rich people returned to comfortable lives. Temporary compassion. Disposable empathy. Naomi expected this night to end the same way. A brief shock. A few tears. Then forgotten. Ethan suddenly knew he could not allow that. Not anymore. One of the older women near the front stood slowly from her table then. Elegant silver hair. Diamond necklace worth more than most people earned in a decade. She looked directly at Naomi. My husband survived a heart attack 3 years ago because of an emergency room nurse, she said softly. I never learned her name. The woman swallowed carefully. I think perhaps people like us become too comfortable being saved. More silence followed. But this time it felt different. Less defensive. More honest. Naomi looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention now. I really should get back to work, she murmured quietly. Ethan almost smiled sadly at that. Work. In the middle of a collapsing billionaire wedding, Naomi Brooks still believed her responsibility was refilling champagne glasses. The realization broke something open inside him completely. He stepped toward the altar slowly, then reached for the microphone resting near the officiant. The room instantly tensed again. Victoria's expression changed from anger to alarm. Ethan, she warned quietly. But he was no longer looking at her. He looked out across the ballroom instead. Across the investors. Politicians. Celebrities. Journalists. People who spent their lives measuring worth through status and access. Ethan lifted the microphone slowly, his voice calm but unshakable now. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the beginning of my future. The room listened carefully. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again before continuing. But instead it exposed something ugly about the man I became. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. Ethan, please. But he shook his head gently. No. You spent 7 years carrying kindness without recognition. His voice lowered. The least I can do is carry honesty publicly. The ballroom waited breathlessly then as Ethan Cole looked toward the altar, toward Victoria, toward the entire life he had spent building, and finally understood that success without humanity had made him far poorer than he ever realized. The entire ballroom seemed suspended in time after Ethan lowered the microphone. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even the waitstaff standing near the walls had stopped pretending to work, because everyone understood they were witnessing something far more unsettling than a ruined wedding. They were watching a powerful man confront the possibility that he had built an extraordinary life while slowly losing the part of himself that once deserved saving. Naomi felt overwhelmed by the weight of every eye in the room. She never wanted to become the center of anyone's story. Survival had taught her to stay small, stay polite, stay invisible enough to avoid becoming a target. But tonight invisibility had shattered beneath crystal chandeliers and camera flashes, and she no longer knew where to place her hands or her eyes or her breathing. Ethan, she said softly, almost pleading now, please stop doing this to yourself. Ethan looked at her with quiet disbelief. You still think this is about protecting me? Naomi swallowed carefully. I think people make emotional decisions when guilt catches up to them. The honesty in her voice stunned him. She was not trying to manipulate him. She was trying to save him from public regret. Even now, Victoria stepped closer immediately, desperate to reclaim control before everything collapsed completely. Finally, she said sharply, someone here is being rational. She turned toward Ethan with visible frustration. You are humiliating both families over nostalgia. Ethan looked at her calmly. This is not nostalgia. Then what is it? Victoria demanded. Ethan took a long breath before answering. It is the first honest moment I have had in years. The sentence struck the room like cold rain. Victoria stared at him as though he had slapped her publicly, though his voice never once rose above calm disappointment. Naomi looked deeply uncomfortable now. You do not owe me your life, she whispered. Ethan's expression softened painfully. That is exactly the problem. He glanced around the ballroom again. For 7 years I convinced myself success meant never needing anyone. His eyes found Naomi's once more. But the most important moment of my life happened because someone with nothing stopped to help me. Naomi shook her head immediately. I was not someone with nothing. Ethan frowned slightly. Naomi lifted her chin for the first time all evening, quiet dignity settling across her face like armor. I had compassion, she said softly. That is not nothing. The ballroom fell silent all over again. Several guests lowered their eyes instantly, unable to withstand the truth inside that sentence. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest, because Naomi Brooks had just exposed the emptiness hidden beneath so much wealth without insulting anyone once. That was her power, not anger. Grace. Victoria let out an exhausted breath and looked toward the cameras recording every second of the disaster unfolding around her. "Do you understand what tomorrow will look like?" she asked Ethan quietly. "Every headline, every business network, every investor meeting." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. And you are willing to throw everything away for this?" she asked. Ethan looked toward Naomi again, really looked at her. The tired eyes, the careful posture. The woman who gave up nursing school to keep her mother alive, while people like him spent thousands of dollars on flower arrangements for one evening. "No," he answered quietly. "I think I have been throwing away the wrong things for years." Victoria's face finally hardened completely. Whatever hurt remained inside her transformed into pride. Cold, sharp, defensive. "If you walk away from this altar," she said carefully, "do not expect forgiveness." Ethan lowered his gaze briefly. "I do not." Then slowly, deliberately, Ethan Cole reached for the wedding ring on his finger. The movement sent visible shock through the ballroom. Gasps spread instantly. Naomi's eyes widened. "Ethan, no." But he gently slid the ring free anyway. The small circle of platinum caught the chandelier light for one brief second before resting quietly in his palm. Victoria stared at it like she no longer recognized reality itself. Ethan stepped toward her carefully, not cruelly, not dramatically, just honestly. "You deserve someone who values the same things you value," he said softly. "And tonight I realize that man is not me." Victoria's eyes filled instantly, though pride refused to let the tears fall. Around them, nobody spoke. Nobody even reached for a phone anymore. The spectacle had become too human for entertainment. Ethan then turned slowly toward Naomi again, still holding the ring in his hand, and for the first time all night the billionaire no longer looked powerful. He looked free. 6 months later, people still argued online about the exact moment Ethan Cole's life changed. Some said it happened when he removed the wedding ring beneath the ballroom lights. Others believed it started years earlier on a rain-soaked highway outside Boston. But the truth was quieter than that. Real change rarely arrives like thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a tired woman carrying a silver tray while everyone else looks past her. The internet had turned that wedding into a cultural storm within hours. Clips of Ethan walking away from the altar flooded every news station in America. Headlines called it shocking, reckless, romantic, career suicide. But the moment that spread fastest online was not the broken engagement. It was Naomi Brooks standing silently beneath crystal chandeliers, while wealthy strangers slowly realized they had mistaken humility for insignificance. Millions of people replayed the clip where she calmly said, "I had compassion. That is not nothing." The sentence appeared on coffee mugs, social media posts, graduation speeches, even church signs across small towns. Funny how the world finally listened once cameras were involved. Naomi herself hated the attention at first. She almost quit her job after reporters started waiting outside the hotel entrance. But something unexpected happened instead. Thousands of nurses, single mothers, hotel workers, and emergency responders began sending her letters. Not celebrity letters. Human letters. Stories about exhaustion, sacrifice, quiet kindness nobody noticed. Naomi read every single one. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed how carefully she handled people's pain, even when carrying her own. That part never changed. 3 months after the wedding, Ethan quietly funded a scholarship program for emergency nursing students forced to leave school because of financial hardship. He named it after Naomi's mother, Denise Brooks, despite Naomi arguing against it for nearly 2 weeks. "People are going to think I asked for this," she complained softly one evening while they organized donated medical equipment inside a newly renovated community clinic in Brooklyn. Ethan smiled faintly while carrying a stack of supply boxes across the floor. "That is because you still think kindness is something people need permission to deserve." Naomi shook her head, but she smiled too. Small, real. The kind of smile that only appears once someone finally feels safe enough to stop apologizing for existing. The clinic itself became another unexpected headline. Formerly abandoned office space transformed into a 24-hour emergency support center for low-income families facing medical crises. Free transportation vouchers, emergency meal assistance, temporary medication funding, practical help, human help. Ethan insisted the project stay grounded in dignity rather than publicity. No giant portraits, no luxury branding, just resources and respect. One rainy afternoon, months after the wedding, a young waitress working double shifts arrived at the clinic in tears because her father needed surgery she could not afford. Naomi sat beside her for almost an hour listening quietly before helping arrange support. Ethan watched the interaction from across the room and suddenly remembered the woman kneeling beside him on cold pavement years earlier. Same calm voice, same instinct to comfort first and speak second. Some people do not become compassionate because life is easy. They become compassionate because they know exactly how heavy survival feels. Victoria Hale eventually released a carefully worded public statement wishing Ethan well and announcing plans to continue her family's philanthropic work overseas. The media moved on after a while. It always does. But certain stories leave fingerprints behind. Months later, guests who attended that wedding still spoke about the silence that filled the ballroom after Naomi said she had compassion. Because deep down, everyone understood the uncomfortable truth hidden inside that moment. Wealth impresses people. Humanity changes them. One winter evening, long after reporters stopped calling, Ethan and Naomi stood outside the Brooklyn clinic watching fresh snow collect along the sidewalks beneath the city lights. Patients continued moving in and out through the front doors behind them, while volunteers carried donated blankets toward the lobby. Ethan glanced at Naomi quietly. "Do you ever wish none of that happened?" Naomi looked out at the street for a long moment before answering. "The wedding." Ethan nodded once. Naomi smiled softly beneath the falling snow. "No," she said, "because for one night, people stopped looking at status long enough to see character." Ethan looked at her carefully then, understanding something at last that success had never taught him. Money can fill a room with attention, but grace is what changes the room forever.